And then it's like processing now. There's a little loading bar. It's
Okay.
going a little slow. And then I'm just watching the site to make sure. Okay, so it looks like that processed, and then it'll be just a little bit more of a delay.
Okay.
Okay, so it looks like it's loading,
Awesome.
and just giving it. Okay, we are good to go. So let's just dive in. Hello, and welcome to the SLP Summit. I am Marisha from SLP Now, and I am one of the sponsors of the SLP Summit, along with the co-creators, Sarah and Lisa from SLP Toolkit. And we are very excited that this course is being offered for ASHA CEUs, but we just have some logistics related to that. So all attendees will be able to print out a course completion certificate at bethebrightest.com after achieving 80% accuracy on the quiz. And then to have Bright Ideas submit your hours to the ASHA registry for ASHA CEUs, you will need to follow these 5 steps to make that happen. And then that's for each individual course that you attend. So the first thing is to pay the Bright Ideas administrative fee, and that does cover all courses in the current summit. So it's a one-time fee for all 8 courses. Then you'll want to attend the entire course, complete the course evaluation, achieve 80% accuracy or higher on the quiz related to that course, and then confirm your ASHA details and submit this info on the ASHA tab inside the course details. So you'll just see nice little check marks. They turn green as you make progress. So you'll just want to make sure that you complete all of those requirements, see all the green check marks before the deadline on January 31st, 2020 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. And the replays will be available through January 26th. And Bright Ideas cannot report your information to ASHA unless you complete all of these steps. So after the course is officially concluded, we hope that you'll stay on with us for additional giveaways. And now, without further ado, we finally get to the good stuff. I'll introduce our presenter today, and then she'll take it from here and share all the awesome information. So today's speaker is Dr. Kelly Farquharson. She is an SLP and associate professor, as well as director of the Children Literacy and Speech Sound Lab at Florida State University. Her research interests include school-age children with phonological and language disorders, the effect of those disorders on the acquisition of literacy skills, and the cognitive, environmental, and academic factors that contribute to phonological and language disorders. Her work is published in the American Journal of Speech-Language Pathology, the Journal of Speech-Language and Hearing Research, Language, Speech, and Hearing Services in the Schools, and many, many more. And I am so incredibly excited that Dr. Farquharson is sharing her knowledge today. She always shares a lot of her clinical experience. She's definitely been in the trenches along with us, in addition to her amazing research background. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Dr. Farquharson.
Thank you so much, Marisha, and thank you all for being here today. I'm so excited that I finally get to present at SLP Summit. I've never really been able to make it work, and I'm excited that this year I was able to make it work. So I'm thankful to Lisa and Sarah at SLP Toolkit and for Marissa at SLP Now for putting this conference together. I think it's just fabulous, and I'm really excited to be here today. So I'm going to be talking about why speech sounds matter for literacy, and that's a lot of information to cover in a short amount of time, but I do want to orient you to just a few things, and one is the supplemental resources that I provided along with this handout. So wherever the handouts are located, if you also see a file. I think it's just Farquharson _ supplemental materials. And in that document, I have a ton of links for you. It also has all of my contact information, which I'll go over in a little bit too. But I've got tons of links in there to a variety of resources that I don't necessarily talk about in this presentation, but there's a free phonological awareness screening test and a variety of other screenings and recommended assessments that I won't necessarily talk about, but I wanted you to make sure that you had access to, and lots of other links to other resources, some free and some not. But I just wanted to make sure that you knew about that before we start. So thanks again for inviting me and for letting me participate this year. And as Marisha said, I'm a faculty member at Florida State. And so, sorry, that should say Florida State. And I do receive a salary for that job. So that's my financial disclosure. And as a part of my job at Florida State, I am the director of the Children's Literacy and Speech Sound or Class Lab. And so today we're going to talk about pretty much my favorite thing to talk about, which is how speech sounds are related to literacy and reading acquisition. But in particular, I would like you to, at the end of this, to be able to identify the role of phonological representations, to discuss the risk factors and outcomes for children with persistent or remediated speech sound disorders, as well as those who have dyslexia, and discuss how we as SLPs can facilitate literacy skills for children who have speech sound disorders or dyslexia or both. I also want to just give a quick disclaimer that I am at home and I have two screens. So I'm looking at my screen over here, and I also may at some point turn my video off, only because I have a clouder of cats who like to walk across my desk as I'm presenting. So we'll see how they behave today. So I just like to start with some of my contact information so that we can continue the conversation past today's quick 1 hour workshop. And so first is my lab website, so classlab.cci.fsu.edu. I saw some go Knowles in the chat, so I'm excited to see that. I do have a pretty active Instagram account for the lab as well, classlab_FSU. And so I post there pretty regularly and would be happy to answer some questions on my stories after this if you are interested, or if you're listening to this later, maybe we can catch up on social media. And then Twitter and Facebook as well are pretty active for the lab. So some of these questions for me about the connection between speech sounds and literacy came about from my time as a school-based speech language pathologist. I worked in the public schools in Pennsylvania for 4 years before going back for my PhD. And I kind of saw this, what appeared to be a subgrouping of children who had speech sound disorders. So I was really trying to rack my brain to figure out how these kids operated. Basically, I was really interested in kids with speech sound disorders and really curious how some of them had difficulties with literacy and some of them didn't. And so from my observations, it kind of seemed like they fell into 4 distinct groups. And this is really just based on observations, but I will tell you a little bit about the research behind it now. So at the top, just to orient you here, what this is referring to, that top header of remediates, this is whether or not a child with a speech sound disorder remediates that speech sound disorder by, 2nd or 3rd grade, yes or no. And then across the left side, you have literacy problems, yes or no. And so, we've got this first box here of children who do remediate their speech sound disorders, but don't have any literacy issues. Those are kind of our gold star kids, the kids that we hope we see on our caseload that remediate and achieves age-appropriate speech sound production and have no later issues with literacy. But of course, we know that's not always the case. So then in the opposite corner, we've got kids who don't remediate and who also have issues with literacy. And so it's a possibility for those kids that their underlying phonological system is truly impaired. And what can be really tricky about that is that the way that their speech production errors manifest may not necessarily indicate to us that there's a phonological issue. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. But it's a possibility that these are kids who have a true phonological deficit. Then we've got kids who don't remediate, so their speech sound production doesn't get better despite treatment, but they don't seem to have any issues with literacy. And so that's a really perplexing group of kids. I'm trying to figure out a little bit more about who those kids really are. Perhaps those are children who have a motor deficit. We have a lot more work to do to really figure out what the underlying issues are with that population of kids. And then finally, we've got the kids who remediate, so their speech sound production gets better, but they do still have issues with literacy. So perhaps for those kids, there's more of a linguistic based deficit. Again, we need to figure out a little bit more information. Maybe the two are unrelated. I have a hard time believing that they're unrelated, but it's a possibility that those two conditions are perhaps unrelated. And so this is kind of just setting the stage for how I've been thinking about this condition of speech sound disorders as it relates to literacy. And I'll talk a little bit about how what we know about the research over time, how that changes over time as well. So I think to set us up a little bit, I want to talk about what reading really is. I do have access to the chat here. And so I will ask you a few questions, and I'll just kind of look for some responses in the chat as we go along. So I want to first tell you a story. We've got this grandfather and this grandson. And the grandfather was born and raised in Germany during a time that it was very common for particularly young men to not complete school. And so this grandfather went to school until about 6th grade. And he then emigrated to the United States and has lived here for about 50 years in the United States. First language is German, now does also speak English. And then he's got this grandson who's in 3rd grade. And the grandson, born and raised in the United States and speaks only English. And so the grandfather comes across this old German text, and he's reminded of the time in his life when his mother used to read him stories from this text. And so he says to his grandson, I would just love to hear some of the stories that are in this text. And I remember when my mom used to read it to me, can you read this text to me? Because, I don't have literacy skills in German. And so the grandson says, well, I don't have literacy skills in German. He says, well, just give it a try. Just, take a look and sound it out and try to read it. So the grandson is looking at the text, and he's looking at the words on the page, and he's doing his best to sound them out. And the grandfather is understanding what the grandson is saying to the best he can. And he's remembering the story and remembering the narrative and hearing the story, and really nostalgic of this time in his life when his mom used to read the story to him. So in this narrative, in this example, who's actually doing the reading here? So is it the grandfather or is it the grandson? So Marisha said there might be a little bit of a delay for your comments. Okay, some are saying both. Some are saying grandson. Some are saying both, grandfather. Okay, so overwhelmingly I'm seeing both. I would argue neither. I did see some of you say neither. Neither one of these people are reading. Neither one of them. The grandfather isn't reading because he can't look at the page and decode the words on the page. The grandson isn't reading because he can look at the words on the page and say them out loud, but he's getting no meaning from it whatsoever. So perhaps if you mean both by putting them together, yes, but really neither one of them alone is doing the reading. What we need in order to actually truly be reading are both skills. We need to be able to look at the words on the page and decode them accurately, but also understand and follow the story as it's being decoded, either out loud or in our heads. And so this is the idea behind a theoretical framework that I use in a lot of my research and is common in a lot of reading research, and it's the simple view of reading. And this was originated in 1986 by Goff and Tumner. And this framework suggests that reading comprehension is comprised primarily of word recognition and listening comprehension, and that these are the two skills that are necessary for successful reading comprehension. And so if you have a child who's struggling with reading comprehension, we really need to get to the root of what the problem is, because it's a possibility that their issue with reading comprehension is based in word recognition or word decoding. It's also a possibility that their issue lies within listening comprehension. And so reading comprehension by itself, when we test that, or when we talk about reading comprehension test scores, there's so much underlying that skill that it makes it really challenging to fully understand what a child's skill level is, unless we break it down into these two primary kind of subsystems of word recognition and listening comprehension. And so as simple as this might sound, it's actually really not that simple. And this is my favorite way to really depict the simple view of reading. So this is an illustration by Hollis Scarborough. And, if you Google the reading rope, you'll find this image. And it's really common, especially in reading research literature, to help us think about all of the factors that feed into successful reading comprehension. So just to orient you here, across the far right side, what you have where you see the tightly woven rope, this is skilled, fluent execution of reading. And this is where we expect kids to be by third or fourth grade, depending on the curriculum and the state, of course. But there's so much that goes into that. And so if you follow the rope over to the left side, you see a variety of skills that feed into that tightly woven skilled execution of reading. And you'll see that it's broken into two larger strands, with the top one referring to language or listening comprehension, and the bottom one referring to word recognition. And there's so many skills that underlie each one of these. So we call this the simple view of reading because we know that it simply requires word recognition and listening comprehension, but there's just so much that goes into each one of those that it really is much more complex than just those two. And what you'll notice as you look through this list is how many of those skills are language related. Right? So almost all of the skills necessary to be a skilled reader are language based. And so the majority of children who exhibit difficulties with literacy have some sort of underlying language issue. What we're thinking about today are mostly kids who have speech sound disorders. And so we'll be focusing primarily on that bottom larger strand of word recognition and the skills that feed into that. So how does this apply then to children who have phonological impairments? So first, let's define what we mean here by phonological impairments. So we're talking about two primary groups of kids. One, children who have speech sound disorders. And for our purposes, that's both articulation and phonology. And the second group of kids are kids who have dyslexia. And that includes children who have difficulties with word reading and phonemic decoding. And we'll talk a little bit about what each of these mean in a minute. So I think one important thing with respect to speech sound disorders, just to get us all on the same page, is this idea that it's referring to both articulation and phonological disorders. And I think as a field, we've spent a lot of time trying really, really hard to keep those two things black and white and separate. Articulation and phonological. Is it an artic issue? Is it a phonological issue? And in 2006, Bruce Pennington published this paper talking about a variety of comorbidities, not specific to speech sound disorders, but including speech sound disorders. And he really suggests that this is also 2006, so 14 years ago, which is just mind-blowing. But he really suggests that we dissociate this idea of thinking that these are two separate things, and that we really start thinking about how interrelated they are, and perhaps they exist along a spectrum. And that's really how I approach the idea of speech sound disorders, that articulation and phonological disorders are not two different things. They really are maybe a spectrum of the exact same thing. And one of the reasons that it's problematic to try really hard to keep them separate is that articulation disorders, when we call it that, we're assuming that the underlying issue is motor programming related, but most of the time we're not actually testing that and seeing if motor programming is impaired. And same goes for when we call it a phonological disorder. We call it that based on the manifestation of the speech sound production, but we're not actually testing the underlying phonological representations to see if that's what's impaired. And so it's best that we use the term as speech sound disorders broadly, And you may notice that across most ASHA documentation now has been fully updated to call it speech sound disorders. Most courses have been updated to no longer call it articulation and phonological disorders, but to call the class speech sound disorders. And that's one of the main reasons for that. So when we think about this population of kids, we know just at a very basic level, these are kids who have a hard time acquiring age-appropriate speech sounds, and that this is one of the primary populations continually over the past decade that have been treated by speech language pathologists, particularly in school-based settings. And we know that speech sound disorders can impact academic, linguistic, vocational, social, emotional skills in children and adolescents, and that some of those issues can persist even once the speech sound disorder has been remediated through speech therapy services. And so some follow-up studies have looked at children who were diagnosed with early speech sound disorders and found that they self-reported to require some level of special education services through 12th grade, 50 to 70% of those children who were adults once they were asked to report on this. And so this is really a population of kids that are frequently overlooked. There's a very troubling trend that I've presented on, and I won't have a lot of time to talk about today, across schools in which there's an assumption that there's no educational need or adverse educational performance for this population of children without really looking to see how it is impacting literacy and classroom success. So more than half of children who have speech sound disorders experience difficulties with reading. That's been long documented. And in some ways, it makes sense that there's this disconnect, because when there's an issue with the phonological system, as evidenced by difficulties with speech sound production, it makes sense that that would be a system that's also impaired in the ways that we need to use those speech sounds for literacy. And so those are the same speech sounds. That's the same phonological system that's necessary for decoding and spelling. And a lot of that is related to phonological awareness. So as far as prevalence goes, prevalence rates are always really tricky, because we're all, especially in the United States, we're really only able to measure the frequency of something occurring according to the number of people that we can recruit in a study to report it. Other countries have different reporting metrics, and so are potentially more accurate because they're able to track people over time through their healthcare systems. And so to the best of our ability, we've tried to estimate how common it is to have a speech sound disorder. And certainly Larry Schreiberg and his colleagues have done a great job in this effort, saying that 11 to 13% of kids between the ages of 5 to 7 have a speech sound disorder. And then between the ages of 9 and 11, we see that rate also hovers around 10%. This particular stat comes from the UK, and they do have a much more solid and robust reporting metric for persistence and prevalence of diseases and disorders. So perhaps that's a little bit more robust. And then in the UK, they've also reported that 8-year-olds, about 18% of that age range, have unresolved speech sound errors, which of course we know is far too late to still have difficulties with speech sound production. And then in this interesting study, although it's very dated now, they looked at how many college freshmen had issues with speech sound production, reporting about 1.4% in that population. And so the reason why these prevalence rates are interesting and helpful to think about is because we need to also be thinking about how at risk these children are for reading deficits. And so we're currently in this interesting stage where we just assume that if a child has a speech sound disorder and a language impairment, that child will definitely have issues with reading. And that is most definitely true. But then we assume if there's just speech sound production issues, and we say it's just speech, it's just our tick. And if you've heard me talk on this topic before, you know that just our tick is like fingernails on a chalkboard to me. We say, oh, it's just our tick. That child only has issues with speech sound production. They're not as at risk, but that's certainly not true. And one of the things that we do know now through extensive research over time is that a lot of these kids who have issues only with speech sound production likely include a subgroup of children who have dyslexia. And what we see is that this speech sound disorder is an early red flag for dyslexia, because it's showing us very early on that children have difficulties accessing and using this phonological system. what we see is that it manifests as difficulties producing and using speech sounds. Over time, that use of speech sounds is necessary for decoding and spelling. So we see that there's a very obvious and direct connection between early speech sound production difficulties and later diagnoses of dyslexia. So let's talk a little bit about what dyslexia is. So this is a language-based problem. It's a phonological processing disorder that's neurobiological in origin. It is present from birth, so it's not something that someone gets or acquires over time. It is something that's neurobiological, meaning you have it when you're born and you will very likely have it for your entire life. However, it can really exist along a spectrum. So there's a variety of severities that can exist with dyslexia, from self-reported annoyance to severe limitation. It is more common than any other learning disability, but importantly, it's responsive to expert-informed instruction. And so we know that children with dyslexia can acquire literacy skills, they can acquire reading skills. And so we need to be able to identify these children and determine earlier when they might be at most risk for ending up with a diagnosis of dyslexia. And so that's really important, because if we can find them early, we can provide services early, and by the time they're in third grade, they're not failing. So our current system is that we wait until they fail and then we provide services. But we've got really huge red flags that they're at risk for a diagnosis of dyslexia, and one of those red flags is a speech sound disorder. So what we see in dyslexia are weaknesses with word reading, phonemic decoding, and spelling. And so very quickly, word reading is just single word, real word reading, whereas phonemic decoding is non-word reading. So decoding words in the English language, or I'm sorry, words that follow a legal spelling pattern in the English language, but aren't real words in English. And it's a surprising diagnosis because most children with dyslexia have normal IQs. And there's a lot of variability there too. There can certainly be variance in verbal and nonverbal IQ. But one of the issues is that we see a lot of kids who have dyslexia not qualifying for services because their IQ is normal. But that's exactly the profile that we typically see in dyslexia. And so also, because this is a lifelong disability, we do know that adults who've compensated with dyslexia often are poor spellers, or they've acquired enough literacy skills to be able to decode, but they're still pretty slow at decoding. And they have a particularly hard time with novel or complex phonological forms. And so one of the accommodations that I see a lot in the schools that I consult with for children with dyslexia is, especially in high school, is that children are, they can opt out of a foreign language, because learning a foreign language is really challenging, because that's learning a whole new phonological system and phonological forms. And so that's one of the accommodations that's really common in dyslexia. And so it's just as important as it is to talk about what dyslexia is, we also have to talk about what it's not. And it is not characterized or identified by seeing letters backwards. That's not a reality in dyslexia. People with dyslexia do not see letters backwards. The idea of letter reversal in handwriting is totally developmentally normal until about second grade. You may see a child who has dyslexia continue to reverse letters for longer than that. A lot of them don't. A lot of them never do. So it's just not, it's a complete myth and a misnomer. Dyslexia is not indicative of gifted status. So we can have a variety of IQ levels in this population. We don't have to wait until third grade to diagnose. We have some early warning signs like difficulties learning letter names and sounds, speech sound disorder. It's not a visual problem. So using things like colored lenses and colored overlays or prism lenses are not going to help, because it's not an issue in the vision system. And so all that to say, we need to be thinking about this connection between speech sounds and literacy, and dyslexia is a really nice convergence of the two. And what we also see in this population of kids are deficits with phonological awareness. And so we talked about phonological awareness as one of the small strands in the reading rope. And so let's dig in a little bit to what phonological awareness really is. So we'll go back to this reading rope, and you'll see that it is one of the small strands here in under word recognition. So it's a very important aspect of being able to be a skilled reader. It's necessary and crucial to being a skilled reader. But what's really important here is looking at the big picture to see that it's not the only thing that's needed. So it is important, and I'm going to talk a lot about it, but it's not the only skill that's needed in order to become a skilled reader. So it's great, but we need to make sure that we're including all of these other skills as well. Okay. So phonological awareness, as I'm sure you all know, is referring to our sensitivity to the sound structure of a word. And we typically measure this by rhyming, blending, and deletion tasks. And I have on your supplemental resources, I have a few links to free phonological awareness tests, and also a few that are not free, but that I recommend, like the CTOP, for instance. We know that research supports a causal link between phonological awareness and early reading, such that good phonological awareness in kindergarten leads to good readers in second and fourth grade. Longitudinal studies have shown us that. And poor phonological awareness in kindergarten leads to poor readers in second and fourth grade. So this is a really powerful and early skill that we can measure as early as preschool, certainly as early as kindergarten, and it's very predictive of what later skills can be. So it's a really important one to make sure we're including in our test batteries for kids with speech sound disorders. It does exist along a continuum, so it's not one skill set. There are some phonological awareness tasks that are easier than others. And so, for instance, rhyming is an easier, let's put that in air quotes, easier phonological awareness skill, because I say air quotes because it's some kids really struggle with it. So it doesn't mean it's easy for everybody, but along the full spectrum, or under the umbrella of phonological awareness, it is one of the easier ones. So some other phonological awareness skills include sentence segmentation. Sorry, my clicker isn't working here. Syllable segmentation and blending, identification of initial or final phonemes, and manipulation of individual phonemes. And so you'll see that the two boxes towards the right-hand side of your slide are blue. And the reason for that is because these two slides, or these two boxes, represent phonemic awareness. So there's a difference. These terms are used interchangeably, but they are not interchangeable. Phonemic awareness is referring to sensitivity to phonemes, individual manipulation, identification, recognition of individual phonemes, whereas phonological awareness is really just the broad term referring to rhyming and wordplay and recognizing and sensitivity to the sounds in the language. So phonological awareness is the umbrella, and phonemic awareness falls under that as one type of phonological awareness, but it's very specific. And so we want to be careful when we're thinking about talking about a child's phonemic awareness skills. If we've measured that through rhyming, we have not measured phonemic awareness. We've measured phonological awareness. And so we want to make sure we're clear on that, because children who have speech sound disorders or children who have dyslexia really struggle mostly with phonemic awareness. And so we want to make sure we're clear on that. And then to contrast that with one other term, we contrast that also with phonics. And so I make the distinction for my students in class that phonological awareness is an eyes closed task. So when we think about different kinds of phonological awareness activities, like deletion of sounds, for instance, so say cat without k. So I didn't show you any letters for that, right? There's no visual representation there. It's really just listening to the sounds, saying the word, and then saying it without one of the phonemes. You don't need any visual representations. When you add orthography, when you add that visual representation of graphemes, now it's phonics. And so the skills look very similar, but they're nuanced enough in their differences. It's really important we're aware of how that might contribute to a child's performance. Some kids do really well on phonics-based tasks because there's orthography there. The graphemes are a visual representation of the sound, and that can help them kind of bootstrap into that learning. But they might still struggle with phonemic awareness without any visual representation. And so we need to be aware of how orthography is influencing that performance. So I have a test for you. We're going to test your segmentation skills. And what you're going to do here, and of course you are skilled at phonetic transcription and the International Phonetic Alphabet and thinking about sounds instead of thinking about spelling. So what you're going to do here is think about the sound sequence in each one of these words, and we'll go through this together, and I'll ask you to participate in the chat. And we'll go through each word. And what I want you to do is take the sound sequence of the words and then reverse the sound sequence. So you do have to completely ignore the spelling, reverse the sound sequence. And for each one of these words, each 9 of these, you'll come up with a new real word. Okay, so the first word that we have is teach. And so we'll do this example together. So we've got t, e, ch in teach. And when we reverse those, we've got ch, e, t. So t, each becomes ch, eat. So teach becomes cheat. So it's not a reversal of the letters, it's a reversal of the sounds. Okay, so I'm going to have you guys do the rest with me. They're not going to come up on the screen. So I'm going to ask for you guys to participate. The second word, what do you get when you reverse the sounds in sigh? I haven't seen the right answer yet. I've seen eyes. I've seen his. There it is. Lori in New Jersey. Ice. S, ice. Okay, what about cuts? Stuck. Yeah, good. How about speak? Speak. It's a little bit of a delay. Yeah, good. Speak keeps. Sp, eek, k, eeps. Jab. Badge, good. Seen. Niece. Might. Whoo, this is going fast. I don't see any for might yet. Time, there it is. I'm. And tax. Not axe. Scat, there it is. There it is. Tax. T-a-k-s, sk, at. And caught. Talk, I saw it. I saw someone as it's scrolling through. Caught, talk, good. So this is just an example of how tricky it can be to segment and think about the individual sounds in the words. This is obviously not a task that we would want to do for our littles, particularly those who have speech sound disorders or dyslexia. This is really challenging, obviously, especially even for people who have a background in phonology and speech sounds. This can be really challenging to think about sounds this way, but it is a nice illustration of how much cognitive function it can take to really think about the sounds in the words. So sometimes we ask kids, just tell me a word that rhymes with cat. Listen to the end. What does it sound like? At. What other words sound like that? What do you hear? What do you hear? Listen to it, right? But it's not that easy. And particularly if your phonological system is impaired, you're not going to be able to hear those things in the same way. Your perception is different. And so they need a lot of practice and a lot of modeling and a lot of repetition, but they also need their speech sound production to be corrected in order for them to have access to a robust production of that sound. So my next few slides have some information about this connection between phonological awareness and speech sound disorders over time. So the first slide is preschool, and then we've got school age, and then there's a slide on adolescence. And so lots of credit here goes to Jonathan Preston and the work that comes from his team. He does some amazing work. He's at Syracuse. He does some amazing work, particularly looking at preschoolers and their connections with speech sound disorder, preschoolers with speech sound disorders, their connections with phonological awareness. And so we know that this is a population of kids who are at risk for deficits with phonological awareness. And Jonathan Preston's work has also helped us to think about the kinds of speech sound errors that might be more at risk than others. So atypical speech sound errors in particular, and distortions. So atypical speech sound errors like a lateral lisp, which is not a normal sound in English. So that's an atypical speech sound error. Something like backing is atypical, or distortions. So some of our R production sounds might be indicative of or predictive of weak phonological awareness skills. And this is true even when language is normal. So all of these studies have been conducted on kids who have normal language. These are kids who have just speech sound disorders of a variety of severities. And so Sue Rulstone out of the UK, she's done some great work looking at the proportion of sounds in error and longitudinally following those kids over time. And she's found that the proportion of sounds in error at age 5 is related to the likelihood of those errors persisting at the age of 8. And so again, we need to be mindful of how many sounds are in error so that we can be thinking about early services. So now when we move to thinking about school age kids, we've got children who have persistent speech sound disorders. This was actually my dissertation study, 2012. Children who had persistent speech sound disorders between 2nd and 5th grade had markedly weaker phonological awareness skills compared to their same age peers. Continued work out of Jonathan Preston's lab. This was an MRI imaging, magnetic resonance imaging study, looking at cortical processing in children who were school age and who had residual speech sound disorders. So I say residual because that term is often used in a way that makes it sound like it's not that big of a deal. It's kind of this leftover issue and not like a real problem. And it is a real problem. And particularly because in this population of kids between 8.5 and 10, they found that these children exhibited cortical and subcortical differences during phonological processing tasks compared to typically developing peers. So their brains are processing phonological information differently. And these are kids who have normal language. And again, longitudinal work of those kids who had atypical speech sound errors in preschool were found to not only have issues with phonological awareness concurrently, but to have it longitudinally. And so kind of a rule of thumb that came out of some of that work was that if more than 10% of the child's speech has atypical errors, again, a lateral lisp, backing, initial consonant deletion, something odd and atypical like that, the child's likely to have deficits in phonological awareness, reading, and spelling. And then when we turn to our adolescents, we again see these 10 to 14-year-olds with residual speech sound errors, no comorbid diagnoses, have weaker phonological processing skills compared to same age peers. Excuse me. And again, once the speech sound disorder has been remediated, we sometimes see continued deficits with phonological processing. And so that has been shown in some of the work that's come out of my lab, and the Raitano paper is also a really interesting study looking at kids who've remediated their speech sound production but continue to have a hard time with phonological processing. So sometimes we dismiss them before they really have fully acquired the phonological representation. So we use this information for early identification, which hopefully leads to early intervention, which hopefully leads to reduced risk of reading disorders. So we do have some pretty clear early indicators of difficulties with reading, and that includes issues with oral language and issues with speech sound development. We know that there's some very particular risks, early signs for risk for dyslexia, which include family history of reading or language impairment, difficulty learning letter names and sounds, consistent use of unusual or non-developmental speech sound errors, multisyllabic words. And so again, we see these patterns with speech sound production are early warning signs for dyslexia. Things that are not early warning signs of dyslexia are reversing letters when writing, and some of those common speech errors that you might see on long words, like saying aminal instead of animal, or paschetti instead of spaghetti. Those types of errors are common in development and not necessarily signs of dyslexia. And so another reason why phonological awareness is so important to measure and understand is that it's really testing phonological representations. It's really a robust depiction of what the strength of the representations in the memory system. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about memory. and what I mean by phonological representations here. So what we're talking about are the building blocks of written and spoken language. Phonological representations refer to how speech sounds or how phonological information is stored in our memories. And so this is my depiction of what a weak phonological representation might look like. And so this is the B phoneme. And so you can see it's kind of wobbly and weak, and it's, has some blurry lines. It's not a very clear B phoneme by contrast to this strong phonological representation, which is very clearly a B phoneme, right? And so when I think about how these representations might be stored in memory, I think about these kind of wobbly and weak and fuzzy representations compared to very clear representation. And we know studies have shown us that kids who have speech sound disorders have underdeveloped phonological representations, and that it's a possibility that they have a hard time, children with speech sound disorders have a hard time accessing those representations because their working memory resources are limited. And so I'm going to share with you in a few slides just a teensy droplet of a study that we did looking at working memory skills in this population of kids. So it's a possibility. Now, thinking back to one of my very first slides, thinking about that subgroup of kids who had remediated or not and literacy issues or not, it's a possibility that some of the underlying cause for some of those issues, or why we see those subgroups, could be related to working memory or cognitive processing. And so the way that this could affect reading is letter sound correspondence. Children need to learn decoding skills. They need to learn letter sound correspondence. And part of that is learning sight words. I have a whole diatribe. I could go on for the next hour just on sight words, but I'm gonna again give you just a teeny little drop it. Maybe next year's SLP Summit we can talk about sight words a little bit more. Sight words are referring to the sight of the word immediately activates the pronunciation and meaning in your memory. And so that's really all it's referring to. They're not a different kind of word. They're not special in any way except for their high frequency, so we see them a lot. There's nothing different about the way that you decode those words or the way that you can or should decode those words. They're just simply high frequency. We see them a lot. And so the fact that we see them so frequently should quickly activate our pronunciation and meaning and memory. And so to build those sight words in our memory, we need this process of orthographic mapping. So for orthographic mapping, in addition to phonological representations, we need orthographic representations. And so this is referring to how we store graphemes or letters. Sorry, I'm not sure if you can hear that alert. That's getting some software alerts. I'm sorry about that. So orthographic representations, this is referring to how graphemes or letters are stored in our long-term memory. So the same way that we have to store speech sounds in memory and access them later, we also have to store letters and letter patterns. And so similar to my depiction of phonological representations, I also have a depiction of orthographic representations. And so this is the letter B. As you can see, it's kind of stretched out. The lines are fuzzy and blurry. And so it's not obvious at first glance, especially, and certainly without context, that it's the letter B, by contrast to a strong orthographic representation that every time we come back to it and see it in print, it looks the same, we can access it, and we know exactly what it is. And so if we're trying to map these two systems together, which is required in order to decode and eventually spell words, but one or both of the systems are fuzzy or have those fuzzy edges, we're going to have a really hard time making those connections. So this is just an example of that, looking at orthographic representation with weak representations compared to strong representations. Some of this idea, I don't have time to really dig into this, but some of this idea is underpinned by the self-teaching hypothesis, which is a really exciting theory that I like thinking about, that really tells us that literacy is fueled by repeated exposure to phonology and orthography. So basically being read to a lot and looking at the print while you're being read to is how we acquire literacy. So it's not really self-teaching, but it's exposure. Is basically seeing the word and hearing the word pronounced repeatedly is going to lead to, ideally, is going to lead to literacy. And so these ideas of these representations mapping onto one another work in both ways. So we have phonological representations that need to map onto orthographic representations. An example of this is pony and baloney. So we have the sounds that sound the same, but they map onto very different letter patterns. And of course, this is the American butcherization of the word baloney, right? So pony and baloney, they sound the same, but when you see the letter patterns, those sounds are mapping onto very different graphemes, very different orthographic representations. And then the inverse is also true, that we can have letter patterns that look the same, but they map onto very different sounds. So as in cough, through, rough, and though. We've got OUGH, that letter pattern that looks the same, but it maps onto different sounds. And so this connection needs to be very solid in order for those mappings to happen. And for kids who have speech sound disorders or dyslexia or both, that connection is really weak. And so this idea of mapping is going to be really challenging. And I think I just said that. So I want to quickly talk about working memory. So this was a study that we did looking at working memory in a population of kids who had persistent speech sound disorders. They were between 2nd and 5th grade. All of the kids, so we had 40 kids total. We had 20 who were typically developing in that age range, and 20 who had persistent speech sound disorders. So most of them had a single sound error, either R or S, lateral or frontal lisp. And I think a couple of them had more than one sound in error, but the majority were your kind of run-of-the-mill just RTIC kids. And I was really curious about this idea based on the self-teaching hypothesis and this idea of exposure and this idea of phonological representations and how we store these sounds in our memory. Is working memory responsible for this difference that we're seeing in these kids? So if we see these deficits in these representations, which we know leads to deficits in phonological awareness, and that obviously then leads to deficits in literacy skills, is it working memory that is kind of responsible for why the phonological representations are in deficit to begin with? So working memory is a really interesting cognitive construct, and it's basically referring to this short-term limited active memory space. So whenever you have to, well, maybe this will date me, but whenever you had to memorize someone's phone number really quickly before you dialed it, right? And so you kind of set it over and over in your head, and you would dial it and then you could forget it, right? So that temporary storage space is working memory. So it's active, it's temporary and it's active. And so there's a variety of ways that it's been conceptualized across cognitive psychology. And the model that I tend to like the most is Baddeley's working memory model. And the reason for that is because there's a specific system allocated for processing phonological information. Some of the other working memory models don't necessarily allocate space for that. So I tend to like this one. But so this is a three-pronged system where we've got this central executive space. And that central executive is responsible for kind of allocating attention to the appropriate subsystem. So either visual spatial or phonological loop. The visual spatial sketchpad is responsible for processing and storing and paying attention to visual information. And the phonological loop is responsible for processing, paying attention to sound information, phonological information. And I think that's what these next few slides say. So we know the phonological loop is most involved in language processing and development and has a positive relationship with speech and language acquisition. And so in this study, which I'm really not going to show you much of, but I do have a link to, I believe, in your supplemental resources, but I'm also happy to chat more about later. We wanted to see if there's a difference in working memory skills in kids who had speech sound disorders in school age and kids who didn't. And we really also wanted to see, would we see differences across all three subsystems within Baddeley's working memory model, or would we see it isolated to the phonological loop? And so for the sake of time, I'm only going to tell you the results and not walk you through exactly how we measured this, but I would love to talk more about this another time. We really did find no differences with their central executive processing, no differences with their visual spatial processing, but major differences in their phonological loop processing, meaning children who had speech sound disorders had much weaker phonological working memory ability compared to their typically developing peers. And so again, this is a first step in kind of thinking about this idea of the cognitive differences that we see in these kids who otherwise are kind of just our TIC kids who we may not even pick up for services because we say, oh, it's just an R kid. They only have one sound and error. There's nothing else going on. But there is something else going on, and it's at the cognitive level. There's a working memory deficit, and there's probably a lot more going on with these kids than we know. And so this is definitely something that we need to explore more, but it's certainly the case that there's a lot going on with these kids that we sometimes overlook, almost for the sake of understandably protecting our own caseloads. And so some conclusions here, we did find that children with speech sound disorders, and that's PSSD, persistent speech sound disorders, appear to have deficits specific to the phonological loop of working memory. And then in particular, I didn't go through what the tasks actually were for the sake of time, but we found that when the lists of words that they had to repeat got longer or were multisyllabic, they had particularly difficult time. So when language is harder, when there's more to listen to, when the words are longer as they get in third, fourth, fifth grade, that's when they really break down. So they have an okay time rhyming and repeating and playing around with small words, short words, just a few words at a time. But the more words you give them and the longer and more complex they are, the more that they experience difficulties. And so this really helped us to think about the limited phonological representations that this population of children experience, as well as very potentially limited working memory, at least in the phonological system. Again, we need much more work in this area, but this was, there have been studies after mine that have helped to substantiate this a little bit more as well. And so a few additional resources in addition to what you have in your supplemental information. Here at Florida State, we have the Florida Center for Reading Research, which is just chock full of information. Their website is on your supplemental resource, I believe, and you can also just Google that. And there's tons and tons of information, including screeners and curricula. The National Center on Intensive Intervention, the International Dyslexia Association. Decoding Dyslexia is an organization that I've been actively involved in for the past 5 or so years. They have national and state-based chapters. It's a grassroots parent-run effort to help normalize the diagnosis and treatment of dyslexia, particularly in schools. If you're not yet a member of the Facebook group Clinical Research for SLPs, I am an administrator of that group, just full disclosure, but there are tons of great resources in that group. We do weekly discussions. We haven't started back up for 2020 yet, but we do weekly discussions led by experts. So if you search the group for hashtag week 9, there's a discussion I led, and hashtag week 16 in that group, a discussion on dyslexia that was led by Dr. Tiffany Hogan. And then, as I mentioned, the supplemental materials provided for you through SLP Summit. So that was taking a drink from a fire hose, I think. And I know that's a ton of information and you probably have some questions. I've asked Marisha to help me navigate through some of the questions, but I also do want to encourage you to contact me after, either through email, my email address is there, or through any of my social media channels, with Instagram being my new favorite love. So at @classlab_FSU. I have a lot of great conversations with SLPs there, and will on my Instagram stories, will open a chat box for us to have a dialogue and we can chat a little bit more about this. And my website, classlab.cci.fsu.edu, also has a tab for publications. Anything that's published and that I can legally share is there in PDF form. There's also all of our handouts from the ASHA convention in Orlando this year are there. So there's lots of resources there too. So I'd love to hear what questions you have in the next 4 minutes. And thank you again for inviting me and for spending part of your evening with me.
That was amazing. So much good information.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Farquharson. So incredibly helpful. And we also have a lot of questions. So we will fit in as much as we can. And you did mention hopping on Instagram stories potentially.
Yes.
So maybe I can share those with you, and I'll share the link to your profile so people can head there if they want to find more. But the first question was, so they said, we need to have data or evidence that the disorder has a negative impact on the student's education. How can we get that? How can we get data that the SSD has educational impact during an evaluation?
Yep. My best advice is to ask for spelling tests. So ask the teacher. Teachers do so much testing, and it's testing that we often forget about or maybe think that we don't have access to or can't use. Especially if the teacher is the one referring to the child, the teacher can help you collect some of that data. So spelling tests are going to be your best friend. That's going to really help you show. So I've got a whole new line of research coming out on the connection between spelling and speech sound disorders, which is really exciting. But it stems from all of this, which is this connection of the orthographic representations being weak as a result of the phonological system being weak, and then what that looks like in spelling. And so we do see that connection, and that's something that you have access to. Reading tests, so particularly if they're timed, if the child has had to read certain words, you can look through and do an error analysis to see which words are they missing. Do they happen to be missing longer, more complex words? Do they happen to be missing correct production of words that have their speech sound error in it? Those are some free, easy, and non-time consuming for the SLP sources of data.
Yeah, love it. And then the next question is, even though phonological awareness predicts reading success or difficulty, I remember learning in grad school that there was not strong evidence for treatment targeting phonological awareness skills such as segmenting, deletion of sounds. Is that still current?
So I'd say there could be some truth to that in some ways, meaning that you can't teach phonological awareness as a fragmented skill. So you can't teach it in isolation, really. It's a good thing to work on. It's a really good thing to test because it's very predictive. But working on it as a skill, it has to be made relevant. So it has to be connected to, you're working on this skill because you need to know these speech sounds, because you need to eventually be able to decode words you've never seen before. And you need to be able to spell words that you've never seen before, or words maybe that you have seen before, right? And so it needs to be made relevant, and it needs to be contextualized. And so teaching it as a splinter skill is not going to work, and by itself is maybe only going to improve that particular skill, is not really going to translate across decoding. So it has to be made relevant within the context of decoding and of encoding of spelling.
So incredibly helpful. So I wish we had like another hour to dive into all the questions.
Me too.
But this marks the official end of the course. And then we'll just do some couple quick logistics and a giveaway. So again, if you want Bright Ideas to report your participation to the ASHA CE registry, please be sure to pay the conference fee, give course feedback, pass the quiz, and enter your ASHA info to opt in no later than January 31st, 2020 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. And we cannot make any offer any extensions or make any exceptions. And then something else to note, the replays are available through January 26th, which is a different date than the the submission deadline. And then all attendees will be able to print out a course completion certificate at bethebrightest.com after achieving 80% accuracy on the quiz. So now for the good stuff. So Dr. Farquharson is offering a super fun giveaway. Did you want to share what that is?
I forget what I said
Oh,
I was
okay.
going to give away. So.
Okay, so they're your tumblers, right?
Oh yeah, Tumblr. Yeah.
Yeah. So she has some super cool lab tumblers that she's offering. So we will pick 2 live attendees. We'll send you an email um, once we have the live list, and 2 lucky attendees will win the mug or the tumbler. So yeah, that is a wrap for today. I am pasting Dr. Farquharson's, oh, there we go, in the right place. So I just posted her Instagram link, and if you want to hop on there and answer some more questions, I can send those your way. And that's just a great place to connect with her. Thank you again. You are such an amazing resource. I loved your
Thanks.
presentation, and you
Thanks for
are
having me. I really enjoyed being here, and I would be happy to present again and go into more details. And I'll be on Instagram stories later today and also tomorrow. So thanks again.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for attending.